Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It was just another routine shift. The hum of the machines, the soft click of buttons, the occasional chime of the phone. I sat at my desk, taking a deep breath as I adjusted the headset. The noise of the office was a dull, constant background, other operators talking, the buzz of voices, the murmurs of conversations. My job was simple: listen, guide, reassure. I had been working at the hotline for nearly 2 years now. It was a job that required patience and empathy. People called for help, for guidance, for advice. Sometimes the calls were mundane, other times desperate. But they were always, in some way, human. That evening, though, something felt off. It was a small thing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The air felt heavier than usual, a strange weight pressing down on my chest. I chalked it up to tiredness. I'd been here for hours already, and the long shifts always did that to me. The phone rang. I adjusted the headset again and answered with my usual, professional greeting. Hello, this is the hotline. How can I assist you today? Silence. I waited for a moment, expecting the usual response, a voice on the other end, either distressed, calm, or confused. But there was nothing. Just silence. I repeated the greeting. Hello, can you hear me? How can I assist you? Still nothing. Just the faintest sound of something, almost like breathing. It was slow, shallow, not the voice of someone on the other end of the line. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Maybe it was just a glitch. Sometimes the lines acted up. I cleared my throat. Is there anyone there? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Then, almost imperceptibly, I heard it. A whisper. It was so faint at first that I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, unmistakable. Emily. My name. A cold chill ran through me. There was no way they could know my name. This was a hotline, anonymous calls. There was no way anyone could have known. My fingers tightened around the receiver. I could barely breathe as I tried to compose myself. Who is this? I asked, my voice trembling just slightly. But there was only silence again. No response, no sound, nothing. I glanced at the display on my phone. No number, just a blank screen. A feeling of dread settled over me. This wasn't right. Something about this felt wrong. The breathing on the other end had become more pronounced now, almost like someone was standing right next to me, but there was still no voice. Just the sound of shallow, uneven breaths. I told myself it was just a prank, a glitch in the system. I had to be imagining things. But the longer I sat there, the more my heart raced. The office was suddenly too quiet. The hum of the machines seemed distant, like they weren't even there anymore. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't know what to do. I was trained to deal with all kinds of emergencies, but this was something else. I pulled the headset off, stood up, and walked over to the supervisor's desk. But as I did, the whisper came again. This time it was louder. Emily. The name sent a shock of cold through my body, and I froze. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. This was no longer just a strange occurrence. It was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I hurried back to my desk, half expecting to find someone on the other end of the line. But the phone was still silent. I sat back down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was nothing. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my breath felt shallow. I had to get this under control. I grabbed the headset again, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to act normal. Hello? Is someone there? I spoke into the receiver, my voice shaking. This time, the response came almost immediately, but it wasn't a voice. It was something else, something worse. A soft, dragging sound. Like footsteps, slow, deliberate. The kind of sound you hear when someone is walking in the dark, just on the edge of your hearing. It was so faint that I almost doubted I heard it at all. But there it was again. Thud. 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 I turned to look at the office around me. The light above flickered for a brief moment, and in that instant, I could swear I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around. There was nothing. The room was empty. The phones were silent, save for the one on my desk, still whispering my name. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, my mouth dry. What was happening? Who was calling? And more importantly, why were they calling me? I sat frozen, staring at the phone. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, continued, each sound reverberating through the receiver, but there was no one on the other end. My hand hovered above the headset, trembling. The whispering was still there, distant but unmistakable. My name, as though it were being spoken by someone standing right behind me. Emily. I ripped the headset off and looked around the office, feeling the walls closing in around me. The lights flickered again, and for just a second, everything went dark. My heart raced as I scrambled to press the light switch. When the lights returned, nothing had changed. Everything seemed as it was, empty, silent. But the feeling of dread was thick, palpable. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It's just a malfunction, I whispered to myself, though the words felt hollow. I was trying to convince myself more than anything. I had to focus. This wasn't the first time there had been issues with the system. Glitches happened. But this felt different. I wasn't sure if it was the strange sound, the whisper, or the sense of being watched. It was all too much. I turned back to my desk, setting the headset carefully aside. I needed to report the issue, but the thought of speaking to anyone else made my skin crawl. I grabbed the keyboard and typed up a quick message to the technical team, asking them to look into a potential system malfunction. The words came out quickly, my fingers barely keeping up with the flood of thoughts racing through my mind. But then, a soft click came from the receiver. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keys. The phone was still off, still dead. Yet the click, sharp, purposeful, had come from the line itself. I stared at the receiver, wide-eyed, as I waited. Seconds passed like hours. The air in the room was stifling, every little sound amplified in my ears. Then, the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't just my name. Don't look. The voice was distorted, muffled, but there was no mistaking the command in it. My blood ran cold, my breath catching in my throat. I should have hung up. I should have turned off the phone and left the office. But I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the receiver. "Don't look." I wasn't sure if it was the whispering that paralyzed me or the sensation that there was someone, behind me. The air felt thicker now, the temperature dropping, and with it, an overwhelming feeling of isolation. I slowly turned my head toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway outside was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something had changed. The office no longer felt like a safe, familiar place. It felt haunted. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of a door creaking. It was coming from somewhere in the back of the building, down the corridor where the restrooms were. It shouldn't have been that loud. The sound wasn't natural, as if someone was deliberately making it. But the offices were empty. I turned back to the phone. My breath was shallow, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. It wasn't just a whisper now, it was the atmosphere around me. The space felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. Thud. The footsteps again. But they weren't coming from the receiver. They were closer now, muffled by the sound of carpet, but unmistakable. I stood up, my legs weak beneath me. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my palms slick with sweat. I was certain now, this wasn't just a glitch. This wasn't some prank. There was something else happening. The door creaked again, louder this time, as if someone was pushing against it from the other side. I took a hesitant step toward the door, my body tense, my senses alert to every sound. The air felt heavy, thick with dread. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent. "Emily. Emily." I gripped the door handle, ready to pull it open. But as my fingers brushed against the cold metal, the lights flickered once more. This time, they didn't come back on. The room plunged into darkness, the only sound now the thudding of my heart, the slow breath of something unseen just behind me. The hair on my neck stood up, and I could swear I felt a chill press against my skin, as if someone, was standing right there, just beyond my reach. I pulled the door open and stepped into the hallway, the darkness swallowing me whole. My feet moved on their own, urging me away from the office. But as I moved down the hall, the whispering followed me. The hallway stretched before me, long and narrow, lit only by emergency lights that flickered weakly. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, the sound of my footsteps muffled against the carpet. The silence in the office had been replaced by an eerie stillness, as though the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned the corner toward the restrooms, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't fully process. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. I needed to understand what was happening, what I was up against. The whispering had stopped, but it was as if the air itself was filled with a quiet, gnawing tension. I could feel something watching me, though every time I looked around, there was nothing. Only the shadows, stretching and shifting in the dim light. The door to the restrooms was ajar, and the strange creaking noise I heard earlier seemed to come from within. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the door. There was something unnatural about it, about the way it moved ever so slightly, as though pushed by an invisible force. But then, I heard it again, soft, barely audible. A breath. A sound too quiet to place, but so close it felt like it was coming from behind me. I turned around quickly, my heart thundering in my chest. The hallway was empty. No one. But the sensation, the feeling of being watched, was overwhelming. I could almost feel the gaze of something unseen lingering in the dark corners of the office. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, trying to steady my nerves. My palms were slick with sweat, and my breath caught in my throat. But I couldn't let fear control me. I had to get to the bottom of this. I pushed the restroom door open cautiously. It was darker inside than I expected. The small room, usually bright and sterile with white tiles, now felt cold, suffocating. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing unnervingly as the door creaked shut behind me. The mirrors on the walls were darkened, the lights flickering intermittently. I scanned the room, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I noticed that the faint smell of something metallic hung in the air. Blood? The thought was ridiculous, but the scent felt real. I stepped forward, closer to the sink, then froze. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It was a figure. A shadowed form, standing just behind me. Tall, its features obscured, but the shape was unmistakable. My breath hitched in my throat, and I spun around, expecting to see someone in the room with me. But there was no one. Just the empty restroom. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, closer now, its presence more defined. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it, feel the emptiness it carried, the coldness radiating from it. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off the mirror. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling in the silence. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move either, but I could feel it watching me. Something twisted deep inside me, telling me I needed to leave, to get out of the room before it was too late. I turned and dashed for the door, yanking it open with frantic urgency. But as I stepped into the hallway, I saw the figure again, this time standing at the end of the corridor, motionless, its form dark and indistinct. My heart skipped a beat. I was trapped. It was following me. I ran. I didn't care about anything else now. I bolted down the hallway, back toward the office, hoping that the lights would return, that the safety of my desk and the noise of the machines would drown out whatever it was that was chasing me. But as I passed the rows of empty desks, the whispering returned. This time, it wasn't just my name, it was a voice, a single word, spoken over and over again. "Leave." The voice was louder now, more commanding. It echoed through the empty office, reverberating in my mind. I stumbled, my legs giving way beneath me as the chill in the air thickened. The walls seemed to close in around me, the space feeling smaller, more constricting with each passing moment. I couldn't breathe. I looked around frantically, desperate for escape. My eyes locked on the exit, just a few steps away. But as I reached for the door, the whispering stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath, a misty cloud in the air. And then, something moved behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The figure was there again, but this time it was closer. So close I could almost feel its presence, like the air itself had thickened around me. The darkness in its form seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The lights flickered back to life, and the warmth of the room rushed back, as if nothing had happened. But the fear, the suffocating, paralyzing fear, remained. The phone rang again. I stood there, still frozen, staring at the door. The phone rang again, its sharp tone cutting through the eerie silence that had settled in after the figure vanished. I could feel the pounding in my heart and my chest, each beat reverberating in my bones. The warmth of the lights returned, but the coldness from within me, an ice-cold grip, remained. I didn't want to answer. I knew that the call would bring something worse. But there it was, insistent, relentless. The sound of the ringing phone filled the empty office, echoing through the space, pushing me toward the desk. I took a slow step forward, my legs shaky beneath me, and reached for the receiver. As my fingers brushed the plastic, the lights flickered again, casting the room into another brief moment of darkness. But I picked up the phone, pressing it to my ear, my breath shallow. The moment my fingers touched the receiver, the whispering started once more. Emily. The voice was closer now, so close it felt like it was inside my head. It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was softer, almost gentle, but still laced with an unnerving tension. The air around me grew colder, and I pulled the receiver away slightly, my hands trembling. "Who are you?" I whispered into the phone, my voice barely audible, but the answer came immediately, as if it had been waiting for me to ask. "Leave." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating me. I felt it again, the weight of something heavy in the room, something that wasn't human. The air was thick with dread, like a storm cloud waiting to break. The figure I had seen before, no longer just a shadow, was close. I could feel its presence, hovering just beyond my vision, its form shifting in the corners of my mind. "Why?" I asked, the question slipping from my lips before I could stop it. I wasn't sure what I hoped to hear, but I needed to understand. I needed to make sense of what was happening. There was a long pause, the silence stretching, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then the voice came again. "You shouldn't have answered." My blood ran cold. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I pulled the receiver away from my ear, my hands shaking. Something in the tone, something in the way it spoke, felt like a warning. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to hear this. I threw the receiver back onto the desk, but the ringing continued, louder now, more insistent, as if the phone itself were calling me, drawing me back in. But I couldn't go back to that line. I couldn't answer again. The fear had become too much. This wasn't just a strange occurrence anymore. Something, someone, was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. It was beyond a prank or a technical glitch. I backed away from the desk, my mind racing. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to leave, to run as far as I could. But as I reached the door, the whispering returned. This time, it wasn't coming from the phone, it was all around me, echoing through the room like a chorus of voices. "Leave." I flung open the door and sprinted down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor as I pushed my way through the building. The exit was just ahead, just a few more steps, and I would be out. I would be free. But then, as I neared the exit, the door slammed shut in front of me. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes locked on the door, the panic rising in my chest. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. And then the footsteps came again. Slow. Measured. Not from behind me, not from the office, but from right in front of the door. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them, each footfall heavy with purpose. I turned back toward the hallway, looking for another way out. The walls were closing in. The whispers were louder now, filled with desperation, filled with something darker than fear. The shadows in the hallway seemed to writhe and twist, and I could see shapes moving within them, flickering just out of the corner of my eye. The voice came again. You shouldn't have stayed. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my heart pounding in my ears. I had to get out. There was no other choice. I turned and ran down the darkened hallway, not knowing where I was going, just needing to escape. The sound of my feet pounding against the floor echoed like a warning, like it was already too late. The door at the end of the hall was open. It was the emergency exit, the one that led outside to the street. I ran toward it, my mind a blur of panic, fear, and confusion. But just before I reached it, the door slammed shut in my face. And when I turned around, there was no one there. Nothing but the darkness. I was alone. And the whispers were the only thing left. Leave. I stood there, my breath shallow, my chest tightening with every passing second. The door to the emergency exit was locked, its steel frame an immovable barrier. The hallway was dark now, the emergency lights flickering weakly as I stood frozen in place. The only sounds were my ragged breaths and the echo of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The whispers had stopped for the moment, but the air felt charged, as if something was about to snap, something was about to break. The room itself seemed to be holding its breath. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the hallway, the office, the doorways. It was all too quiet now. The coldness that had gripped the building deepened, and I could feel it creeping up my spine, settling into my bones. I had to get out. I had to find a way to leave before whatever was hunting me found me again. The phone, the receiver that had been left on my desk, kept ringing in my mind, an almost unbearable sound. I could feel its pull. It was calling me, luring me back. But I knew I couldn't return to that phone. I couldn't face it again. Not after everything that had happened. But the voice, it wouldn't let me forget. I turned back to the hallway, eyes darting from one end to the other. The feeling of being watched was overpowering. The air was thick with tension, and I was no longer sure if I was alone. I hadn't seen the figure since it had vanished earlier, but I could feel its presence, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting. I took a step forward, my hands trembling, my feet moving almost involuntarily toward the main office. The walls felt like they were closing in. The lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped, the familiar hum of the building's air conditioning replaced by the oppressive silence. Suddenly, the whispering returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the phone, the walls, or the air. It came from inside my own mind. Leave. It was a command. An order I could not ignore. My feet carried me forward, faster now, toward the stairs that led to the ground floor, toward the exit. I had to get out. I had to escape. As I reached the top of the stairwell, I heard it again, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, they were coming from the stairwell behind me. Someone was following me. I wasn't alone. I spun around, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty staircase, the darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely above me. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, closer and closer, as if they were getting louder, nearer, more persistent with each step. I bolted down the stairs, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. The echo of my own footsteps reverberated off the walls, magnified by the empty space. My heart raced, my legs felt like lead, but I kept running. There was nothing else I could do. As I reached the door at the bottom of the stairs, I pulled the handle, my fingers slick with sweat. But it wouldn't open. The door was stuck, the handle cold and unyielding in my grasp. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could feel the air shift as they drew near. I could hear my breath, ragged and shallow, in the quiet of the stairwell. I turned around one last time, heart in my throat, desperate to see who, or what, was chasing me. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the silence. The silence that pressed in on me from all sides. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable. A voice. And this time, it wasn't a whisper. Emily. It was my name. Clear. Loud. Echoing through the empty stairwell. I turned to run again, my legs finally giving out beneath me as panic surged through my body. But as I fell to my knees, something grabbed my arm. Cold. Unyielding. Like ice. I screamed, but no sound came out. My voice was swallowed by the air, lost in the hollow darkness. The figure. It was there again. Just behind me, its form dark and formless, yet solid. Its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The last thing I heard was the sound of footsteps, slowly retreating into the distance. Then, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't just in my mind. You should have left. The room spun, the walls closed in, and the cold darkness swallowed me whole. And then, silence. The silence that followed felt like eternity. It was early, too early for anyone to be awake, but I was already moving about the house. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. The house was silent, still, the kind of silence you only get when no one else is around. I had just gotten out of bed, stretching my arms above my head, when I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the remnants of a bad dream, but then I saw it again, right in front of me. A mark. A chalky, white mark on the door. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it. It wasn't much, just a small symbol. A simple, rough drawing, like a half-finished circle with lines extending outward. It looked like someone had drawn it with a piece of chalk. But I knew no one had been near my door. I lived alone, and I always locked the door before bed. I leaned closer, my hand hovering just above it, not sure whether I should touch it or not. The white of the chalk seemed too stark against the wood of the door. I couldn't remember ever seeing this mark before. I was sure it hadn't been there the night before. Had I missed it? Was I just forgetting? No, it didn't feel right. I had checked everything before going to sleep, and this mark, this was new. The logical part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it had been there for a while, and I just hadn't noticed it. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I grabbed a cloth from the table and wiped the mark away. It wasn't hard to remove, the chalk was soft, and it smudged easily, leaving behind only faint traces on the door. I sighed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. It was probably nothing. Maybe the wind had blown something against the door, or maybe there was some dust on the surface that had left a temporary mark. But as I walked away, something lingered in the back of my mind. That nagging feeling that something was wrong, that something had happened without my noticing. I tried to push it aside, but as the hours passed and I moved through my day, the unease stayed with me. Every time I passed by the door, I would glance at it, half expecting to see the mark again. When night came, I went to bed, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that had taken root in my chest. I locked the door as usual, checked the windows, and finally crawled under the covers, the weight of sleep pulling me down. But I couldn't shake the thought of that mark. The memory of it, vivid and strange, kept swirling in my mind, preventing me from falling asleep. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my alarm buzzing in the distance. Groggy and disoriented, I rolled out of bed and trudged toward the bathroom. It wasn't until I passed by the door that I froze. It was there again. This time, the mark was bigger, more intricate. The simple circle with lines had been replaced by something more complex, squiggly lines that curled in on themselves, a spiral-like shape with sharp points and jagged edges. It looked almost like a warning, like some ancient symbol that didn't belong in a modern world. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. There was no way I had missed it. It hadn't been there last night when I went to bed. And yet, here it was, undeniable. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the mark, my breath catching in my throat. How was this possible? Who had been here? How could they have gotten inside? I lived on the second floor of the building, with no balcony or easy access point. I always locked my door before bed. No one had the key. But this wasn't a prank. This wasn't some simple mistake. This was something else. I reached for the cloth again, but this time I hesitated. A part of me wanted to erase the mark, to make it go away, but another part of me was scared. What if erasing it only made things worse? I swallowed hard, but my hand moved on its own, wiping away the mark again. The chalk smeared easily, just like the last time, leaving only faint traces behind. I thought that would be the end of it, that I would feel relief once the door was clear again. But as I stood there, staring at the now clean surface, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though I had made a terrible mistake. As though the act of erasing the mark had somehow sealed my fate. That day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every car that passed by the building, it all seemed to set me on edge, making my heart race. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone, was trying to communicate with me. And I was scared to find out what they wanted. By the time night fell again, I was already dreading what would happen the next morning. Would the mark be there again? Would it be worse? And what if the next time I erased it, it was too late? I didn't know how much longer I could go on like this. But I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't going to be able to ignore it much longer. The marks were only getting more complicated. They were coming back. And they weren't going away. Not until I figured out who or what was behind them. The night passed in a restless blur, my mind never quite managing to escape the anxiety that clung to me like a shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mark on the door, twisting and changing in my mind, growing into something even darker. I had barely slept, but the morning arrived anyway. The light through the curtains was faint, a gray hue that gave everything an almost lifeless quality. As I walked through the living room toward the door, I felt the familiar tension creeping up my back. The unease from last night was still there, heavy in the air. I stopped in front of the door. And then, I saw it. It was worse this time. Far worse. The symbol wasn't just bigger, it was a complex, spiraling pattern that seemed to twist in on itself like a maze. At the center of the design, there was a sharp, jagged line, like a crack splitting through the door. The mark seemed almost alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't explain. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to get close to it, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. It was as though the mark had a pull on me, drawing my gaze to it despite my better judgment. I took a step forward, my fingers trembling as they hovered above the mark. The air around me felt colder, a chill that ran through my bones. I reached out slowly and, with a deep breath, touched the chalk. It felt cold, damp, different from before. When I wiped it away, it was as though the mark had been there forever, the chalk scraping off in thick, stubborn layers. I wiped harder, desperate to remove it, but the harder I tried, the more the mark seemed to stick. It resisted, as if it were digging into the wood, becoming part of the door itself. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I stepped back, staring at the door, panting. What was happening? Why did it feel as though the door itself were fighting back? I grabbed the cloth again and tried once more, my heart pounding in my chest. The door groaned under my touch, and the chalk began to smear, but it didn't disappear. It spread. That's when I saw it. The marks began to change shape, extending outward, forming new lines that weren't there before. It was as if the chalk was growing, branching out in a way that wasn't possible. I dropped the cloth, stumbling backward, my pulse racing. What the hell was going on? Was someone playing a cruel prank on me? Or was something more sinister at work here? I backed away from the door, still unable to take my eyes off it. The marks were slowly shifting, and I swore I could see them moving, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting into new forms that I couldn't quite understand. As I turned away, I felt the sharp sting of fear in the back of my mind. Someone had been here. Someone had left that mark. But how? When? And why? The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I left the house, I felt a sense of dread gnawing at me, as though I was being watched. The normal sounds of the world outside, the rustle of leaves, the hum of traffic, felt distant, muffled. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. That evening, as darkness descended, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart skip. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper something to me, though I couldn't make out the words. It felt like the walls of the house were slowly closing in around me. At some point during the night, I dozed off, only to wake with a start. I couldn't say why, but something had jolted me from sleep. A sense of wrongness in the air. Something wasn't right. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:07 a.m. I had to check the door. I had to. With trembling hands, I pulled myself out of bed, trying to ignore the feeling of dread that clung to me. I walked down the hallway, my feet making soft, cautious steps against the floor. The dim light from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The mark could be there again. I didn't know if I was ready to face it again, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned the handle slowly and pushed the door open. There it was. But it wasn't the same as before. This time, the mark was no longer a simple symbol or design. It was different, more intricate. The lines twisted and curved, wrapping around the entire door in a complex web. There were symbols mixed in strange, unfamiliar characters, like something out of an ancient language. At the very center, there was a distinct shape, a triangle with an eye in the middle. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. My eyes locked onto the symbol, the eye staring back at me from the door, its hollow gaze somehow unknowing. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, being seen, like someone was standing right behind me, just out of sight. I turned around quickly, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. But the air felt thick. The walls seemed to close in on me, pressing against my chest. The house felt alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it, how to make it go away. And I had no idea who or what was leaving these marks on my door. But I knew one thing for certain: I had to figure it out before it was too late. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, my heart racing, my mind trying to grasp the reality of what was happening. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating, as though the walls were pressing on me, urging me to make a choice, to act before something worse happened. But what was I supposed to do? There was no instruction manual for this. No advice for dealing with something like this. The eye in the center of the symbol seemed to burn into me. Its unblinking gaze made my skin crawl, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I quickly turned away, shutting the door behind me with a force that made the wood creak in protest. I tried to tell myself it was just a hallucination, that I was stressed, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore what I had seen. The mark was real. And the feeling that I was being watched, that was real, too. I spent the rest of the night awake, unable to sleep, pacing in my small apartment. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, more oppressive, like it was counting down to something. As the night stretched on, I became more and more certain that I wasn't imagining things. The marks were connected, each one growing more intricate, more detailed. They weren't just random symbols. They were messages. Messages meant for me. But who was sending them? And why? The next morning, I didn't want to look at the door. I didn't want to see what new horror awaited me. But despite the fear gnawing at my stomach, I couldn't resist. I stepped up to the door slowly, my hand trembling as it reached for the handle. My breath caught in my throat as I opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. And there it was. The mark had changed again, and this time it was worse than I could have imagined. It wasn't just one symbol anymore. The entire door was covered in a tangled web of lines and shapes, an intricate maze that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. In the center of the web was a shape I recognized, a triangle with an eye in the middle. But this time, the eye was different. It wasn't just an image. It looked alive. It seemed to watch me, blink, almost as though it was waiting for me to make my next move. I backed away from the door, feeling my heart thundering in my chest. I was trapped. There was no escape from this. No way out. But as I stepped back, I noticed something else, a small detail that I hadn't seen before. At the very bottom of the door, just beneath the maze of lines, there was a new mark. A single word, written in the same chalky white, as if scrawled by a child's hand. Tonight. The word was simple, but its impact hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a wave of panic flood over me. What did it mean? What was going to happen tonight? I couldn't ignore it any longer. The marks were no longer just warnings. They were a countdown. And whatever was coming, it was coming for me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my thoughts spinning. What had I gotten myself into? Who or what was leaving these marks on my door? And what did the word tonight mean? Would something happen at midnight? Or was the threat more immediate? I had to prepare. I had to figure out what was going on before it was too late. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any answers. The marks were beyond anything I had ever encountered. I went to work, trying to focus on the mundane tasks of the day, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, watching me. But no one was there. No one even seemed to notice that I was on edge. By the time the sun began to set, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore, not with the door covered in those terrifying marks. But where could I go? Who could I turn to for help? No one would believe me. I barely believed myself. That night, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. I stayed close to the door, my eyes scanning the walls for any sign of movement, any sign that something or someone was nearby. As the hours passed, I grew more and more restless. The apartment felt claustrophobic, the air growing thicker with each passing minute. The silence was oppressive, a constant reminder that something was coming. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder in the stillness of the night. And then, just as I thought I might go mad from the waiting, I heard something. It was a faint sound, barely audible at first. A scratching noise, like something running along the wood. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, this time louder, more distinct. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the door. I stumbled to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to protect myself. I reached for the door handle, my fingers numb with fear. And then I hesitated. What if I opened it? What if I faced whatever was on the other side? But then, a thought struck me. What if this wasn't just about the door? What if the mark wasn't just a warning? What if it was calling me? I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't keep running. With trembling hands, I opened the door. And that's when I saw it. Standing in the hallway, illuminated by the dim light from the street lamp outside, was a figure. It was tall, thin, draped in dark shadows, its features hidden beneath a cloak of darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. But I could feel it staring at me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. And then, in the silence of that moment, I heard a voice, not from the figure, but from deep within my mind. You shouldn't have erased the mark. The voice echoed in my head, chilling me to the core. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure stepped forward, and the door slammed shut behind me. And that's when I understood the marks weren't just signs. They were a trap. And I had walked right into it. The moment the door slammed shut, I felt my world tilt. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I turned quickly, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. The figure in the hallway was still there, its silhouette shrouded in shadows, barely visible in the dim light of the street lamp outside. But I could feel its presence as if it were a living thing, pressing in on me, watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. My legs trembled beneath me, and my instincts screamed at me to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, unable to look away from the figure that was slowly stepping closer. You shouldn't have erased the mark, the voice echoed in my mind again, its tone cold and detached, almost amused. The words wrapped around my brain, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I couldn't make sense of it. What mark? What was it talking about? I had only erased what I had seen on the door, hoping that it would end. But now, it was worse. It had come for me. I backed away slowly, my feet dragging as though the floor itself was holding me captive. The figure took another step forward, its movement smooth and deliberate, like it was walking toward me through thick fog. The shadows around it seemed to shift and stretch, warping and twisting as if they were alive, pulling the darkness closer. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the veil of darkness, seeing me for what I was. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out, my voice shaky, desperate. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached up, its long fingers brushing the hood of its cloak, pulling it back just slightly. I could see the edge of its face now, pale, gaunt, with hollowed-out eyes that seemed to gleam with an unsettling emptiness. It was as though it had no features, no expression, just a void, a black abyss that swallowed up all light. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering my question. And then, in a voice that seemed to crawl out of the depths of my own mind, it spoke again. "It's not about why," it whispered. "It's about what you are now." I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. The words twisted in my brain, making everything feel more impossible. What was I now? What had happened to me? And then, before I could react, the figure lunged forward. It moved so quickly, so silently, that I barely had time to register it. But I felt it, its presence closing in on me, filling the space with a suffocating sense of inevitability. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, my pulse racing. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body couldn't move fast enough. The shadows around me seemed to reach out, grabbing hold of me, pulling me into their cold embrace. The figure's hand shot out, grabbing my arm with an unyielding grip. I tried to pull away, but it was like trying to break free from concrete. Its fingers dug into my skin, cold and unforgiving, and a wave of icy dread washed over me. My breath caught in my throat. The figure leaned in closer, its voice a low hiss, like the sound of wind through dead leaves. "You erased the mark," it said again, this time with more force. "But you cannot escape the consequences. The mark is not just a warning. It's a binding, a promise. And now you are part of it." I didn't know what it meant. I didn't understand how or why this was happening, but I could feel the truth of its words sinking in. I was trapped. There was no escaping it, no going back. I had crossed a line. I struggled, pulling harder, my mind racing for any way out, but it was no use. The figure's grip tightened, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming pain shoot through my arm, as though my very bones were being crushed under its touch. My vision blurred, and I thought for a moment that I might pass out. But then, something snapped inside me. A surge of fear and desperation coursed through my veins, and with one last, frantic effort, I pulled free from its grasp. I fell backward onto the floor, gasping for air. I could feel the cold sweat soaking through my clothes, my hands trembling as I pushed myself up. The figure stood just a few feet away, its form still shrouded in darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on me with a chilling intensity. I didn't wait. I couldn't. I scrambled to my feet, my mind too clouded with fear to think clearly. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But as I reached for the handle, I realized the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. I pulled harder, desperation flooding my limbs, but the door refused to budge. I turned, looking back at the figure, and it was closer now. So close, I could hear its breath, low, slow, like the rasp of something ancient. It smiled then. Or at least, I think it did. The shadows around its face seemed to shift, and for a split second, I thought I saw something like a grin, a twisted, horrible grin. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice sending shivers down my spine. "Not now. Not anymore." I felt the air around me grow even colder. The lights in the hallway flickered, casting the shadows into sharp relief. It felt like the world itself was closing in on me, pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to shrink, the ceiling lowering, the darkness crawling toward me like a living thing. I knew I had to fight. I had to survive. But I had no idea how. What could I do against something like this? I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer. And then the lights went out. Complete, suffocating darkness. The last thing I heard was the sound of the mark growing again. The countdown had begun, and there was no turning back. I couldn't see. The darkness swallowed me whole, a heavy blanket pressing against my skin, making it hard to breathe. I could still feel the figure's presence, though, like a shadow looming just at the edge of my senses. It was there, somewhere, waiting. I could feel its eyes, even without seeing them. My pulse raced. My breath was shallow and panicked, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The world around me had turned into an abyss of silence and cold, and I felt trapped, cornered, like a rat in a cage. I reached out, my fingers brushing the wall, hoping to find some kind of anchor in the emptiness. My mind screamed for a way out, for something, anything, that would break this nightmare. But there was nothing. Nothing but the waiting. A faint sound, like a whisper, echoed in the darkness. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The figure was close. It was just waiting for me to make a move, waiting for me to break, to show weakness. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. "You shouldn't have erased the mark." It was mocking me, taunting me. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, swirling around me like a storm. "You thought you could stop it, but you can't." The figure's voice came, low and cruel. "You can't escape your fate. The mark has already been made. The path is already set." I tried to steady myself, to hold on to whatever remnants of courage I had left, but it was hard. So hard. I turned my head, desperately searching for any sign of light, any sign of escape, but there was nothing, only the suffocating darkness. The air felt thick and oppressive, like I was drowning in it. And then I heard it, the scratching. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. Closer. Like nails against a chalkboard, the sound of something, or someone, dragging against the floor. My skin crawled as the noise filled the space, and I could feel my mind beginning to break, to unravel. Suddenly, the door, the one I'd tried to escape through, slammed open. The blinding light that flooded the hallway was almost worse than the darkness. It was too bright, too harsh, and it made me squint, my eyes watering as they adjusted to the sudden change. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure. Its features still obscured by the shadows, but now I could see it more clearly. Its body was tall and thin, like something unnatural, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. It was as though it wasn't quite human. It stepped into the room, the floor creaking beneath its weight, and the air grew even colder, the temperature plummeting as it advanced. I could feel my breath fogging in front of me, the chill biting through my skin. My chest tightened as though the cold itself was suffocating me. "You can't run anymore," the figure whispered, its voice crawling into my mind. "You're mine now." I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the cold floor, and my mind raced with thoughts of survival. What could I do? I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't fight it. It was everywhere, inside my mind, inside my soul. I had erased the mark, but now I realized that it wasn't something you could erase. It was something that had been carved into my very existence. I could hear it now, clearer than ever, the soft, rhythmic scratching noise. It was coming from the door, from the marks on the door. It was growing, spreading. I turned to look, my heart sinking in terror. The marks that had once been simple symbols were now transforming. They were moving, twisting, shifting like something alive, like veins under the surface of the door, crawling across the wood in intricate patterns. It was no longer just a mark, it was a web, a net that was closing in on me. I reached out to touch the door, my hand trembling, but as soon as my fingers made contact, the marks reacted. They pulsed with an energy so powerful it felt like an electric shock, sending a jolt through my body. I pulled back, gasping for air, feeling the overwhelming presence of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on me. The figure took another step forward. Its eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine. There was no pity there, no mercy. Only the cold, unfeeling gaze of something that had no interest in my survival. You erased the mark, it repeated, the words now heavy, like the final judgment. But you can never escape the binding. I wanted to scream, to fight, but all that came out was a strangled sob. I realized, too late, that this had never been about the marks themselves. It was about me. I had erased the mark, thinking it would break the curse, but the truth was worse than I had ever imagined. The mark had never been just a warning. It was a part of me now, a part of this place, a part of whatever twisted force had decided I was its next victim. I tried to back away, but my legs gave out, and I fell to the floor. The room was spinning, the walls closing in. The marks on the door continued to writhe, and I could hear them, whispers, so soft, so faint, but growing louder with every passing second. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but it was no use. The air seemed to thicken around me, like I was drowning in it. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard the last whisper. Tonight. I opened my eyes just in time to see the final mark appear, a symbol unlike any I had seen before, spreading across the door like a living thing, like the culmination of everything that had been building. And then, everything went black. Have you ever seen something in the sky that made your heart race and your stomach churn? Something you couldn't explain, no matter how hard you tried? That night, I saw it. It all started innocently enough, as most strange things do. A group of us, myself, Sam, Rachel, and a few others, gathered at the old park just outside town. We had been chatting and laughing, the warm summer air mixing with the scent of grass and night, when Sam, always the curious one, pointed upwards. Look, he said, his voice full of awe. What's that? We all turned, our conversations dying away as we followed his gaze. At first, I thought it was just a plane, or maybe some distant star. But the more I looked, the less it seemed like either. It was a collection of lights, 5 or 6, maybe more, moving erratically across the sky. The lights started back and forth, shifting in patterns that didn't make any sense. Some were blinking, others solid, but none of them behaved like any aircraft or satellite I had ever seen. They weren't in a straight line. They zigzagged, darted up and down, sometimes hovering in place for a few seconds before speeding off in another direction. Are we seeing this? Rachel whispered, her voice trembling slightly. It was as if she was afraid that if she spoke too loud, the lights might vanish, like a dream you try to hold onto after waking up. I nodded, my eyes wide. Yeah, I see it. But what is it? We all stood there, transfixed, trying to make sense of what was happening above us. The lights continued their unpredictable dance in the sky, and it felt as though time had stopped around us. The park, usually so full of life, seemed eerily quiet. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the trees and the occasional creak of an old swing set in the breeze. The lights moved faster now, spinning in tight circles before darting off in separate directions. Some of them grew brighter, others dimmer. It was like they were playing a game, teasing us. Maybe it's some kind of meteor shower, Sam suggested, though his voice didn't sound convinced. I don't think so, Rachel replied, her voice tense. Meteors don't move like that. We all fell silent, each of us wondering the same thing. What was this? What did we just see? Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights stopped. All at once, the sky was empty again, the night as quiet as before. No sound, no movement, just a dark, starry sky stretching endlessly above us. That was weird, I said, my voice unsteady. Sam, who had always been the skeptic, frowned. It couldn't have been anything natural. I'd never seen anything like that before. I'm going home, Rachel said suddenly, her voice shaky. I don't care if it was a UFO or whatever. I'm done for tonight. We all agreed it was best to head back. I walked home that night with a feeling of unease creeping over me. Something about the way those lights moved, their erratic, almost playful behavior, stuck in my mind. It didn't feel like a natural phenomenon. It felt intentional. The next morning, I woke up to an odd sensation on my skin. My body felt sore, like I had been sunburned or something. I stretched, trying to shake off the lingering sleepiness, and then I noticed it. My arms, my neck, there were marks. Red, angry marks that looked like burns. I stared at them in confusion. At first, I thought it was just a rash or maybe an allergic reaction, but these marks were different. They were raised, the skin looking irritated and raw. As I ran my fingers over them, the pain was sharp, like something had seared my skin. I rushed to the bathroom mirror to see if there were any on my face, but I didn't find any there. However, something about the marks on my arms and neck felt wrong. They were too symmetrical, too deliberate. Like someone or something had drawn them on me while I slept. I wondered if anyone else had experienced the same thing. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my phone and texted Sam. Did you notice anything weird this morning? It wasn't long before I got a reply. Yeah. You too? I shivered. I hadn't even told him about the burns. But somehow, he knew. I quickly texted Rachel, and within minutes, she confirmed the same thing. I woke up with these weird burns, she wrote. I think we're all in trouble. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. The lights we saw in the sky. Could they be connected? Were those strange things in the sky responsible for these marks? How had we all ended up with the same burns? As the day wore on, the sensation of unease only grew stronger. The marks on my skin itched and burned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That feeling I had when I first saw those lights, that sense that something unnatural was in the air, it was still there. It was only the beginning. The rest of the day felt like a blur of confusion and growing fear. The burns on my skin seemed to spread as time passed, some turning a darker shade of red, while others had the appearance of deep bruises. No one could explain what was happening, and no one seemed to have an answer. We were all connected by something we couldn't see, something we couldn't understand. By the evening, the pain had become unbearable. It wasn't just the physical discomfort from the burns, there was something else. A strange sensation, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. A sense of being watched, of being studied by something not of this world. I had hoped it would pass, that maybe we were just imagining things, but deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. Sam and Rachel texted me throughout the day. They, too, had experienced the same strange sensation, the weight of it growing with each passing hour. It was like the world had shifted, and we were now all part of something far bigger than we could comprehend. We made plans to meet up that evening. We needed answers. That night, we returned to the park, the place where it all began. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as we gathered in the same spot where we had watched the strange lights in the sky. The stars above us seemed distant, almost too far away to be real, and the moon hung low, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. As we waited in silence, the tension was palpable. The wind had died down completely, leaving only the quiet sound of our breathing. No one spoke, as if we were all waiting for something we feared but couldn't quite name. Then, out of nowhere, the lights appeared again. They didn't start with a flash, as I expected, but slowly, subtle at first, like a distant glimmer in the sky. Then, as we watched, the lights began to move just as they had the night before. They zipped across the sky, darting in and out of view, moving in erratic patterns. But this time, there was something different about them. They were closer. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my heart pounded in my chest. My breath quickened as I watched the lights, my thoughts racing. Was this the same phenomenon we had witnessed before? Or was something worse coming? Then, a noise, soft at first, began to rise in the air. It was almost imperceptible, like a distant hum, vibrating just below the threshold of hearing. But it grew louder with each passing second, the frequency increasing until it felt like the very air was vibrating with it. I glanced at Sam and Rachel. They looked as startled as I felt, eyes wide, faces pale in the moonlight. We all stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do or how to react. And then, it happened. The lights flashed, and for a brief moment, they formed a perfect circle in the sky, glowing brightly before vanishing completely. In that instant, a powerful shockwave rippled through the air, sending a cold shiver down my spine. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and I staggered back, my knees almost giving way. Everything went silent. And then the screams started. It was Rachel. She was clutching her arms, tears streaming down her face. Her skin, where the burns had been, was now bubbling, as if something was beneath the surface, trying to break free. The marks were no longer just burns, they had morphed into something grotesque, the skin peeling and twisting in unnatural ways. "Sam," she cried out, her voice hoarse with pain. "What's happening to me?" I turned to Sam, but he was already looking down at his own arms. His burns were worse, blisters had formed, oozing with some dark substance. His face was twisted in shock, his eyes wide with fear. I reached for my own skin, hoping that somehow I wasn't affected the way they were. But I was wrong. The marks on my arms had deepened, turned into jagged lines, glowing faintly in the dim light. They pulsed, as if they had a life of their own. "Something's wrong," I whispered. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. The hum in the air was back, louder now, and it was coming from everywhere. It wasn't coming from the lights anymore, it was coming from within us. I realized, with growing horror, that the marks were reacting to something inside of us. They weren't just burns. They were alive. "We need to get out of here," Sam managed to say, his voice shaking. We turned to run, but as we moved, the ground beneath us seemed to shift. The shadows, which had seemed like ordinary night before, now stretched unnaturally, moving like living things. The trees bent, their branches twisting at impossible angles, reaching out towards us. I felt someone, behind me. The presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it getting closer. My skin crawled as if invisible hands were grazing over me. The lights flashed once more, this time much closer, hovering just above our heads. But they didn't move chaotically now. They were focused on us. And then I heard it. A voice, deep and cold, like ice scraping against metal. "You are marked." I froze. The others froze, too. We all turned, but there was nothing there, no one. Just the swirling darkness and the flashing lights above. The voice came again, this time clearer. "The mark is not just on your skin. It is in your soul." The world seemed to bend around us, the air thickening as the lights hovered, spinning around us in a slow, deliberate circle. The marks, once only a mystery, now felt like chains that bound us to something we could never escape. Something ancient. Something powerful. And then, the sky exploded in a burst of light. I don't know how long we stood there, trapped in that circle of light. It felt like hours, but time had no meaning anymore. The ground beneath us continued to tremble, and the eerie hum vibrated through every part of my body, deep into my bones. Every second, it felt like we were closer to the edge of something we weren't meant to understand. The voice, cold and indifferent, was still with us, echoing in the back of my mind. I could feel it pressing against my skull, the words sinking in, burrowing into the very core of my being. "You are marked. You cannot escape." Rachel was the first to scream. Her eyes were wide with terror as she clutched her arms, which had become even more grotesque in the light. The skin was now almost entirely blackened, as if burned by fire, but the way it bubbled and shifted made it clear this was no ordinary burn. "Make it stop. Please, make it stop." Her voice cracked, broken by the pain, by the fear. But no one could do anything. We were powerless, trapped in a moment that felt both endless and instantaneous. I turned to Sam, hoping to find some rational explanation, something that would ground me, but his face was twisted in horror, his mouth agape, his eyes fixed on the lights above. He wasn't looking at us anymore. It was as if he was looking at something else, something beyond us, something we couldn't see. And then, in an instant, he was gone. One moment, Sam was standing beside us, and the next, the ground beneath him cracked open, a jagged fissure tearing through the earth like it had been sliced by a blade. Sam's scream was swallowed by the chasm, his body sucked into the darkness. I stumbled back, heart racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I could still hear the faint echoes of his scream in the air, a distant, fading cry that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Rachel collapsed, unable to stand any longer, her body shaking uncontrollably as the marks on her skin began to glow brighter. The light coming from them was blinding, a sickly, unnatural hue that flickered and pulsed in time with the hum in the air. I dropped to my knees beside her, reaching out instinctively, but as soon as my hand touched her skin, it was like touching a live wire. My arm shot back, a jolt of electricity coursing through me, and I gasped in pain. What's happening to us? I managed to say, my voice trembling. I had no answers. No one did. The voice came again, louder this time, clearer than before. It was like it was inside my head, a cold presence pressing against my thoughts, my very will. You are being claimed. I didn't understand what that meant. What could it mean? How could something claim us? Then, without warning, the lights above us flared up, brighter than the sun, their intense glow bathing us in a harsh, unforgiving light. I had to shield my eyes, and when I opened them again, I saw something in the distance, a shape just beyond the edge of the park. A figure. It was impossible to make out details in the light, but it was there, watching us. A tall silhouette, standing still and silent, unmoving. Without thinking, I stood up, my legs weak but determined. I had to get to Rachel. I had to get her out of here. I didn't care what this thing was or why it was happening. We couldn't stay here. Not like this. But as I took a step forward, the ground shifted again, and the lights flashed, blindingly bright, blurring my vision. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the hum grew louder, more intense. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, suffocating, like a storm was brewing above us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body felt like it was being pulled in every direction at once. I reached out for Rachel, but she wasn't there anymore. Her form had twisted, warped, as if the burns on her body had somehow consumed her, like they had turned her into something else entirely. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. The figure in the distance was closer now, moving toward us, its steps measured, deliberate. It had a presence, an air of inevitability about it. And then, as it came into view, I saw it for what it truly was. A person. Or at least, what looked like one. The figure was tall, shrouded in a cloak of darkness, its face hidden in shadow. Its hands were outstretched, glowing with the same unnatural light that was emanating from the marks on our skin. But it wasn't the hands that made me freeze. It was the eyes. Eyes that glowed with the same eerie light, but their gaze was empty, hollow, like there was nothing inside, nothing human. It stopped just a few feet from me, and for a long moment, we simply stared at each other. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. It was as if time had stopped entirely. Then, with a voice that reverberated through the air like thunder, the figure spoke. You will never be free of the mark. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The figure raised its hands, and the lights above us exploded into a chaotic storm of energy, swirling around us, blinding and disorienting. I heard Rachel's voice, weak and distant, crying out to me. But I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The world around me seemed to break apart, dissolving into nothingness, and I realized in that moment that the price of the mark was not just pain or suffering. It was our very souls. I don't know how long I stayed in that place. Time had lost its meaning. It could have been minutes, hours, or even days. I couldn't tell anymore. The world was gone, swallowed by the storm of light that raged around me. My mind felt numb, like I was disconnected from my own body, watching everything from a distance. The figure, standing in front of me, still emanated that suffocating darkness, its hands outstretched, glowing with the unnatural light. I could feel the heat coming from it, a heat that burned my skin but didn't leave any marks. It was as if the light was draining me, pulling something away from me that I couldn't understand. The hum, that constant vibration in the air, had intensified. It filled my ears, buzzing relentlessly, pushing against my skull. I pressed my hands to my ears in a desperate attempt to block it out, but nothing worked. The sound was all-encompassing. "You will never be free of the mark." The words echoed in my mind. They were like a warning, but they also felt like a sentence, something inevitable, something that had already been decided. I couldn't escape. There was no place to run. I blinked, and the world around me shifted again. The lights flickered, and I found myself standing in a different place entirely. It was no longer the park where we had all gathered. Now, I was somewhere else. A vast, empty void stretched out in all directions, and the only source of light was the figure in front of me. My body felt heavy, as if the very air was pressing down on me, making it harder to move. My legs were shaking, barely able to support my weight. I reached out instinctively, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to, but there was nothing. The ground beneath my feet was smooth, featureless, and devoid of life. It felt like I was floating, suspended in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The figure raised its hand, and with a single, fluid motion, the space around me seemed to warp. The ground cracked open, revealing a chasm so deep that I couldn't see the bottom. A dark void stretched beneath me, pulling at my very soul. I stepped back instinctively, but the air felt thick, like something invisible was pushing me toward the edge. I wasn't alone. Behind me, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. I turned, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw what was coming toward me. It was Rachel. Her body was twisted and deformed, her skin still glowing with the same eerie light, but now it was pulsing, as if something inside her was trying to break free. She staggered forward, her eyes wide and vacant, her face contorted in a silent scream. She wasn't the person I had known. Not anymore. "Rachel," I whispered, my voice hoarse, barely a sound above the hum. She didn't respond. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like she was being controlled by something outside of her. She reached out with one trembling hand, and I instinctively took a step back. "Please, don't," my voice cracked, but there was no use. It wasn't Rachel anymore. The lights above us flared again, blinding in their intensity, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything. Then, when my vision cleared, I saw her, Rachel, standing right in front of me, her eyes now burning with the same unnatural light as the figure that had claimed us. "Run," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a crack in her otherwise hollow tone. And in that moment, I realized something. The mark, this curse, this thing we had been marked with, it wasn't just something physical. It was taking over. It was changing us, twisting us into something else. I couldn't fight it. But Rachel, her final warning, "Run," was enough to snap me out of my daze. I turned and ran. The ground beneath me trembled with each step, and I could hear the hum growing louder, the air thick with energy. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. The chasm was still there, gaping, threatening to swallow me whole, but I had to make it. I had to get away. But as I neared the edge, the world around me shattered again. The void expanded, and everything was consumed by the lights, by the hum, by the overwhelming presence of the figure. I was no longer in control of my own body. My movements were no longer my own. Something was pulling me in, drawing me toward the center of the storm, and all I could do was scream. "You are claimed." The voice whispered in my ear again, louder this time, deafening, until it was the only thing I could hear, the only thing that existed. And then, as if the very world was collapsing in on itself, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't sure where I was. The world was silent, eerily so, almost like everything had been muted. The ground beneath me felt cold and uneven, and when I reached out, my fingers brushed against something rough. I had no idea how I had gotten here, but I knew one thing: I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out. But where was I? The familiar park, the vast void, it was all gone. I was somewhere else, somewhere different, and that made everything even more terrifying. The air was thick with a strange energy, a pulsating force that seemed to pull at the edges of my mind. I stood, my body unsteady, my legs weak from whatever had happened. The mark on my skin, it still burned, still glowed, faintly, but with a sickly hue that reminded me of Rachel's last words, "Run." I had to remember that. I had to escape. But escape from what? The ground trembled beneath me again, and this time, I was ready. I looked around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the thick mist, swirling around in the distance, an unsettling fog that seemed to move of its own accord. I couldn't make sense of it. It was like the world itself was shifting, bending, becoming something foreign. I turned in circles, trying to orient myself, but everything was wrong. The horizon was unfamiliar, the sky a dark, oppressive shade that pulsed in rhythm with the hum that still echoed in my ears. It was as though I was stuck in a nightmare that I couldn't wake from. Then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, half shrouded in the mist. It wasn't as tall as the figure before, but it still radiated the same dark energy. The same mark. Its presence filled the air, squeezing my chest in a way that felt like I was suffocating. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, waiting. And that's when I realized this was it. The end. The last moment of my life. I had been marked, claimed, and there was no escaping it. The very thought made my heart stop. The figure knew I was here. It had been waiting for me. You are claimed. The voice resonated in my mind again, as if it had always been there, hidden behind my thoughts. There was no escape. The mark I carried wasn't just a physical change. It was a curse. A sentence. A binding. I was about to turn and run when the figure raised its hand. The ground beneath me shifted, and the mist parted to reveal more figures, countless shadows rising from the earth. They moved as one, silently closing in, their movements fluid and purposeful. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their eyes, watching, waiting. Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel their presence, their cold stare, each of them closing in, each one drawn by the same pull, the same fate. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, as if the very earth had swallowed me whole. The hum grew louder, more intense, until it consumed everything. My thoughts, my vision, everything was drowned in that sound. But then, amidst the chaos, a strange clarity washed over me. The figures, they weren't just shadows. They were us. They were the ones who had been marked, just like me. Rachel, Sam, everyone who had seen the lights. We had all been chosen. The air thickened, and the pressure around me became unbearable. The figures were all around me now, their shapes flickering in and out of existence. The mark on my skin was burning hotter than ever, and I could feel something shifting within me, something that was both foreign and familiar at the same time. A figure stepped forward, its face hidden beneath a cloak of darkness, but I could feel its gaze. It was the same one from before, the one that had spoken the words. It raised its hand, and the world fell into silence. You are the last. The words cut through the air, sharp and final. And in that moment, I understood. I was the last of us. The last to be claimed. The last to carry the mark. The figure stepped closer, and I felt its presence wrap around me like a vice, its grip tightening. My vision blurred as I fought to stay conscious, but the pull was too strong. My body, my mind, it was all being pulled toward that figure. Toward the mark. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself completely, I heard a voice. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Rachel. I looked up, and for a brief moment, I saw her. She was standing among the figures, her face twisted in agony, her body still burning with that sickly glow. Her eyes met mine. There was no hope in them, only a silent plea. And then, with one last surge of energy, I broke free. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. But I ran. The figures didn't chase me. They didn't need to. They already had me. They had already claimed me. I ran, the world blurring around me, my body fighting against the pull that threatened to drag me back into the darkness. And then, nothing. The ground beneath me vanished, and I was falling into the abyss. The hum in my ears had stopped. The light was gone. Everything was gone. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, a whisper in the dark. You will never escape the mark. It started with a question that I couldn't shake off. What would you do if someone you loved, someone long gone, could send you a message from beyond the grave? It was a thought that had lingered in my mind ever since I received the letter. The day was like any other, or so I thought. I had spent the morning cleaning up around the house, a routine I had become used to over the last few months. My grandmother's house, a place where I had spent countless summers as a child, now felt eerily empty without her. The silence seemed to press in on me, a constant reminder that she was gone, taken by a sudden illness that no one could have expected. I was still trying to adjust to life without her, to fill the void that her absence had left in my heart. Her death had hit me harder than I had expected. She had been more than just a grandmother. She had been my guide, my protector, and my closest friend. That afternoon, I went outside to collect the mail. The small post box at the end of the driveway creaked as I opened it, and I sorted through the usual pile of bills and junk mail. But then, something caught my eye. An envelope, not like the others. It was old-fashioned, yellowed at the edges, and stamped with a faded postmark. There was no return address, just my name, written in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The handwriting, the paper, it was her. I couldn't breathe as I held the envelope in my hands, staring at it in disbelief. It wasn't possible. She had been gone for months. She couldn't have said this. I was sure of it. Yet, there it was. I walked back to the house in a daze, my fingers trembling as I held the letter. The air felt thick around me, almost as if the world itself had slowed down. Everything around me seemed unreal, out of place, like I was in a dream that I couldn't wake from. Once inside, I sat down at the kitchen table, still holding the envelope. My eyes were drawn to the letter's contents, but I hesitated. My mind raced, my thoughts spinning in every direction. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was it real? How could this be happening? I finally tore open the envelope, the paper crinkling as I did so. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and as I unfolded it, I saw my grandmother's familiar handwriting scrawled across the page. Dear Emily, I know you're confused, but I promise you, this is real. I'm still with you, watching over you. I see everything, even what's happening today. Don't be afraid. Just listen carefully. At exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon, you will hear a knock at the door. It will be someone you know, but not in the way you think. Don't let them in. Do not open the door. Whatever you do, stay inside. I'll be here, always. With love, Gran. My heart pounded in my chest as I read the words again. This couldn't be happening. How could she know about the knock? How could she possibly know about anything today? She had been dead for months. The letter, the handwriting, it was impossible. But as I stared at it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The details were too specific. Too real. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 3:45. A knock at the door? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just a coincidence. My mind was playing tricks on me. There was no way my grandmother could have sent this letter. I had to be imagining things. But the clock kept ticking, and the seconds seemed to stretch on forever. My hands were clammy as I clutched the letter, my thoughts consumed by it. The words kept echoing in my mind, over and over. At exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon, you will hear a knock at the door. It will be someone you know. The air felt colder suddenly, and I pulled the cardigan around my shoulders tighter, feeling an uncomfortable chill creep up my spine. The house, once a comforting place, now seemed to close in around me. I could hear every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside. It was as if the world had become still, waiting for something to happen. My eyes kept darting to the clock. 4 o'clock was fast approaching. I couldn't stop myself from looking toward the front door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I had to know. I had to see if what Gran had written was true. 4 o'clock. I stood up from the table and walked toward the door. My breath was shallow as I approached it, unsure of what I was hoping to find. The letter was still clutched tightly in my hand, my fingers cramping from the pressure. The silence in the house was deafening. I couldn't hear anything, but the tension in the air was palpable. And then, just as the clock struck 4, a soft knock echoed from the other side of the door. I froze. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. Someone was knocking at the door. My heart raced, and I felt my stomach drop. The letter, Gran's words, rushed back to me. It will be someone you know, but not in the way you think. I stood there for a long moment, unable to move. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Whoever was on the other side of that door was waiting. What should I do? Should I open it? Or should I listen to my grandmother's warning? I swallowed hard, every instinct in me telling me to turn and run. To hide. But the knock kept coming, steady and relentless. I took a deep breath, trembling, and slowly reached for the doorknob. The moment my hand gripped the doorknob, I felt the world shift. Everything around me seemed to blur, as if time itself was stretching, pausing, waiting for the next moment to unfold. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, as my heart thundered in my chest. Every muscle in my body was on high alert, but I couldn't move. I couldn't let go of the doorknob. The knock came again, stronger, louder, almost demanding. I froze. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the strange warning she had left me. Do not open the door. Do not let them in. But who was on the other side? How could I possibly know who it was? My grandmother had been gone for months. This was impossible. Was this some kind of twisted prank? But then, the knock came again. The same rhythm, the same urgency. The letter. How had she known? Was it really her? I stepped back from the door, the letter still clutched tightly in my hand. My legs were weak, my head spinning. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to run, to get away. The knock sounded again, louder this time, as if the person on the other side was losing patience. It was like a signal, a message, and I couldn't decipher it. I felt trapped, like I was in the middle of a nightmare I couldn't escape. I glanced at the clock. The minute hand was almost at the top. 4 o'clock. The knock had been right on time, as if everything was planned, as if someone knew exactly when I would be standing there. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Do not open the door. My grandmother's voice rang through my mind once more, and I shook my head, trying to focus. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. There was no way she could have sent this letter. She was gone. But the knock, it felt so real. Too real. I turned away from the door, my feet moving on their own. I backed away slowly, but then the air around me seemed to change. The silence was oppressive. The room felt too small, too close. My skin prickled as though something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The knock came again, sharp and insistent. Who is it? I asked, my voice trembling, but the words felt hollow in the silence. There was no answer. Just the soft, haunting sound of breathing on the other side of the door. I felt my throat tighten. I knew I should call someone, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something told me not to. I didn't want to speak out loud anymore, didn't want to give voice to the creeping dread that had settled inside me. The letter had mentioned nothing about a voice. It was only the knock, and the words were clear, do not open the door. But then, just as I turned toward the window, hoping to see something, anything, that could explain what was happening, a new noise filled the air. A faint scratching sound, as if something was moving across the door. I gasped and spun around. There, on the surface of the door, was something I hadn't noticed before, a mark. A faint, almost invisible scratch, like a symbol, a word, or some kind of strange writing, just beneath the wood surface. I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of it. Was that there before? I had no idea. It looked as if something had scraped it into the door, but I couldn't tell how or when. It seemed familiar, but at the same time, completely alien. I moved closer, my hand shaking as I reached for it. But as I touched the surface, the mark shifted, as if it were alive. It pulsed, like a living thing beneath my fingertips. I pulled my hand away quickly, feeling a wave of cold spread up my arm, a chill that made me shiver from the inside out. The knock came again, louder this time. And this time, there was something different about it. The knock wasn't just coming from the door. It felt as though it was coming from inside the house, beneath my feet, behind the walls, everywhere. A deep, resonating thud. A hollow, unsettling sound. I backed away, my mind reeling. My legs were weak, and I stumbled, nearly falling to the floor. The room spun as panic set in. I didn't know what to do anymore. Was this some kind of hallucination? Or had something far darker, far more sinister. Come for me? I could still hear the knock, each strike more intense than the last. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the air felt thick, suffocating. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, its minute hand dragging slowly toward 5 o'clock. My breath caught in my throat as I heard a sound, a faint whisper, just below the noise of the knocks. "Let me in." It was a voice, soft but unmistakable, as if it were coming from the other side of the door, but also from within me. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The voice, it was her. My grandmother. But she was gone. She was dead. She couldn't be here. She couldn't have sent that letter, and yet. "Let me in." I backed away from the door, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything. But before I could react, the door burst open. I didn't see anyone standing there, but the cold rush of wind slammed into me, knocking me off my feet. And then, the darkness descended. I don't know how long I lay there, sprawled on the floor. Time felt warped, as if it had slowed down or stopped completely. The door had swung open, yet no one stood on the other side. The emptiness in the doorway stretched before me, as if mocking my disbelief. I felt a coldness in the air, something that wasn't supposed to be in a room so familiar. The wind had stopped, but the chill remained, like a presence I couldn't shake. My skin crawled. I could almost feel it, something watching me from the darkness. My heart was hammering, loud and frantic in my ears, but my body refused to move. I tried to push myself up, but my limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the weight of the moment had seeped into my bones. My fingers brushed the floor, trying to steady myself, but the shadow in the doorway loomed like a thick fog, too heavy to escape. The silence stretched on, broken only by the slow, deliberate ticking of the clock on the wall. 5 o'clock. Time had passed, but it felt as if everything had stopped. The knocking had ceased, and in its place, there was nothing but the feeling that something was out there, waiting. "Grandma?" I whispered, the name coming out in a hoarse, disbelieving breath. There was no reply. I could still hear the echo of her voice, soft and insistent, as if it had been right there in my ear just moments ago. "Let me in." But she was gone. She couldn't have said that. Could she? I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out the image of the empty doorway, the feeling of an invisible presence pressing in around me. But when I opened them again, the room seemed different. The shadows in the corners had deepened, stretching unnaturally. A shiver ran down my spine as I rose shakily to my feet, my eyes darting around the room. I forced myself to move, despite the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. Something was in here with me, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it, its weight in the air, the oppressive darkness that had crept into every corner of the house. I approached the door slowly, afraid of what I might find on the other side, but I couldn't stop myself. My fingers brushed the cold metal handle again. It felt familiar, like home, but in that moment, it felt wrong. I couldn't help myself. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the empty hallway. My breath caught in my throat. It was exactly the same as it had been when I first entered the room. But something wasn't right. The air felt different, thicker, heavier. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat, but the room was still empty. My pulse raced as I backed away, eyes scanning every inch of the space. I noticed the floor for the first time. The marks. There were fresh scratches now, more than before, carved into the wood. They were deep and deliberate, not random. The marks formed a pattern, one that seemed vaguely familiar, but my mind couldn't place it. The symbols swirled like some kind of cryptic language, each one more intricate than the last. I looked up to the mirror on the opposite wall, my reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. But then I saw it. A flicker. A shadow. Something standing just behind me, barely visible in the reflection. I spun around, breath caught in my throat, but the room was empty. Nothing. But the feeling remained. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something ancient, something that should not be here. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as the temperature in the room dropped. I shivered violently. The cold was unbearable, freezing me in place as I realized what I had just seen. The reflection in the mirror hadn't been mine. It was something else. Something else had been standing right behind me. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the room was different. The air had become dense, suffocating, as if it were alive with some unseen force. The door was open now, wide open, and the hallway beyond was bathed in shadow. The faintest sound came from down the hall, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably there. "Come closer." The voice. It was hers again, soft, yet terrifying. My grandmother's voice. But it wasn't coming from the letter. It wasn't coming from anything in the room. It was coming from the darkness. "Come closer," it whispered again, and this time I could hear the faint rustling of fabric, the sound of someone moving in the shadows. My skin went cold as I backed away, my legs frozen beneath me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I turned toward the window, but the night outside had changed. The moon was obscured by dark clouds, and the stars no longer shone. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass as if something was trying to get in. I could feel it, an invisible presence creeping closer, the shadows in the hallway extending like fingers reaching for me. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the air shifted. The shadow was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. The whispers ceased. I collapsed against the wall, trembling, not knowing what was real anymore, not knowing what to believe. Was it my imagination? Or was something truly coming for me? And how did the letter fit into all of this? I took a deep breath and forced myself to stand up, the letter still clutched tightly in my hand. The clock on the wall ticked, steady and relentless. 4 o'clock. But the world outside felt different now. The shadow was still there, watching, waiting for its next move. The door was wide open, and I had no idea what lay beyond it. The cold that had settled in the room didn't lift. It clung to my skin, made every breath feel sharp and labored. I glanced at the letter still in my hand. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it again, the same dark ink forming the cryptic message. The words were no longer just words, they had become a warning, a map, something I couldn't quite understand. I looked at the door. It was open, wide open, as if inviting me into the unknown. I didn't want to move. I couldn't make myself move. Every part of me screamed to leave, but I knew there was nowhere to go. The house felt like a trap, and the very air seemed to shift with each passing second. A loud knock echoed from the doorframe, sharp and insistent. I jumped, heart racing. The noise was unmistakable, like someone was trying to force their way in, or perhaps something. I turned slowly toward the sound, but there was no one there. The hallway beyond was dark, almost pitch black, with only the faintest hint of moonlight creeping in from the edges of the window. The shadows seemed to thicken with each passing second, like they were moving toward me, closing in. The whispering had started again, barely audible but unmistakable. My name. Sarah. The sound of my name in her voice, it was unmistakable, yet wrong. It echoed, distant, from somewhere I couldn't place. It made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My feet were glued to the floor, my legs trembling beneath me. Sarah. I could feel the air in the room shift. The weight of something unseen pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I took a shaky step forward, towards the door, unable to resist. My hand brushed against the cold frame, and for a moment, everything stopped. The knocking was gone. The whispers faded. And then, something was standing at the threshold. Something, or someone. I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew they were there. I could feel it. I wasn't alone. There was a presence, just beyond my vision, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped forward, unsure of what I was doing, but driven by some unseen force. I didn't know if I was in control anymore. The door loomed in front of me, a dark void, and with a trembling hand, I stepped through it. The air outside felt different, colder, thinner. My breath came out in invisible puffs as I moved down the hallway. Each step echoed loudly in the silence, the sound of my footfalls amplified by the absence of anything else. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. The hallway stretched out before me, familiar and yet alien, like a place I'd never been. The walls seemed to close in as I walked, the shadows deeper than they should have been, flickering as if alive. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing by the old, rusted staircase, was a figure. I couldn't make out their features, but I knew they were watching me. Waiting. I froze, my pulse racing, heart hammering in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My gaze locked with the figure, and for a brief moment, I saw something in their eyes. A glimmer of recognition. A flash of something, someone I knew. Someone I shouldn't have been able to see. Grandma? I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move, but the air around me grew heavier. A thick pressure seemed to surround me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest constricted, my vision blurred. It felt like the world was pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, in a low, almost inaudible whisper, the figure spoke. Come closer. The voice was unmistakable. It was hers. But it wasn't. It was wrong. It sounded too distorted, too distant. Like something that had passed through time, something that shouldn't be here, shouldn't be speaking to me. I shook my head, stepping back, but the figure didn't move. It was still there, watching me with those unblinking eyes, waiting. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The pressure in the air was suffocating, and I could feel the darkness closing in, wrapping around me like a blanket. In a desperate panic, I reached for the wall to steady myself, but my hand brushed against something cold. Something wet. I looked down, and my heart stopped. The floor beneath me was covered in what looked like ink, dark, viscous, like liquid shadows stretching across the wood. And in the center of it all, drawn in the ink, was the same symbol from the letter. The one I had seen earlier. I felt a sharp tug at the back of my mind, a pull towards the symbol, a force I couldn't explain. I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved on their own, drawn to the mark on the floor. As I moved closer, I heard the faintest sound, a low hum, almost like a vibration, emanating from the symbol. The room seemed to spin, the walls warping, as if the very space around me was distorting. I was close now, too close. The air felt thick, almost tangible. The figure at the end of the hall remained still, watching, waiting. My hand reached out, fingers trembling, and I touched the symbol. The world shattered. The moment my fingers brushed the symbol, an icy shock coursed through my body. It wasn't just cold, it was alive, crawling under my skin, invading my senses. My vision went dark, the hallway and the figure vanishing into an all-consuming void. I was weightless yet anchored, suspended in a space that defied explanation. Around me, whispers echoed, thousands of voices speaking at once, a chaotic symphony of emotions. Fear, sorrow, anger, they weren't just sounds, they were feelings forced upon me, each one a dagger slicing through my mind. One voice rose above the others. "Sarah," it called, soft but commanding. I turned, or at least, I thought I did. The concept of movement felt strange in this void. And there she was. My grandmother. Or something that wore her face. Her features were familiar, the gentle lines of her smile, the warmth in her eyes. But there was something off. Her presence flickered, her form shifting between solidity and shadow. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. Her smile faltered, replaced by an expression of sadness. "I tried to warn you," she said. "But you didn't listen." "Warn me about what?" I demanded, my voice gaining strength despite the terror clawing at my throat. Her gaze shifted, and suddenly, the void around us filled with images. Fragmented memories, fleeting and distorted. I saw myself opening the mailbox, finding the letter. I saw the strange occurrences, doors creaking open, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. But then the memories shifted. I wasn't just observing, I was reliving them. The moments became clearer, sharper. I saw the letters again, each one containing more than just words. Symbols, marks, instructions. And then the truth hit me like a thunderclap. I hadn't just been receiving warnings. I had been responding. Unconsciously, unknowingly, I had followed every instruction in the letters. Each small action I thought was my own, turning off the lights, locking certain doors, leaving certain windows open, had been orchestrated. The realization made my stomach churn. What have I done? I whispered, tears streaming down my face. You've opened the door, my grandmother said, her voice heavy with sorrow. I tried to stop it, Sarah. But it's too late now. The void began to ripple, the darkness fracturing like shattered glass. Through the cracks, I saw glimpses of another place, an alien landscape bathed in an eerie light, pulsating with a life that felt ancient and malevolent. Something was coming through. No, I cried, stepping back, though there was nowhere to go. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. It's not about intent, she said, her form flickering more violently now. The choice was always yours, even if you didn't realize it. The whispers grew louder, the cracks widening. Through them, I saw shapes, tall, indistinct figures moving toward me, their forms twisting and writhing as if the very fabric of reality couldn't contain them. Run, my grandmother said, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. Run and don't look back. Before I could respond, the void imploded and I was thrown back into the hallway. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of me. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, the creak of footsteps coming from the end of the hall. I looked up, my breath hitching in my throat. The figure was there, no longer just a shadow. Its form was grotesque, an amalgamation of limbs and faces, shifting and contorting in ways that defied logic. Its eyes, if they could be called that, locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I scrambled to my feet, my body moving on pure adrenaline. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just needing to escape. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on forever, the creature's footsteps growing louder behind me. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself outside. The night air was sharp and cold, but it felt like freedom. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest near my house. When I finally dared to look back, the house was dark and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The marks on the doors, the letters, they were warnings, yes, but they were also invitations. And I had let something in. I stood there for hours, watching the house, waiting for the sun to rise. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I noticed something in my hand. It was another letter. My name was scrawled on the envelope in the same familiar handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside were just 3 words, written in a deep, crimson ink. Have you ever seen something so strange, so utterly impossible, that your mind refused to believe it? That's how my day began. It started like any other. The sun had barely risen, its pale light filtering through the blinds of my small apartment. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen as I scrolled absent-mindedly through my phone. It wasn't until I stepped outside that everything changed. The flyer was taped to the street lamp at the corner of my block. A plain sheet of white paper, slightly crumpled at the edges. Bold black letters stood out against the background. Call me. Urgent. And then, below that, my phone number. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had a number similar to mine. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became this was my exact number. Area code, sequence, everything. A chill ran down my spine as I tore the flyer off the pole. My eyes darted around, scanning the street for anything unusual. People walked past, cars hummed in the distance, the world moved as it always did. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Back in my apartment, I tossed the flyer onto the kitchen table and paced the room. My phone sat on the counter, its black screen reflecting my own anxious expression. I couldn't ignore it. My curiosity had already taken hold. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone and dialed the number, my number. It rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then someone answered. Hello, a voice said. My voice. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just similar, it was identical, down to the faint rasp I had when speaking softly. Who is this? I demanded, my voice shaking. The person on the other end chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. It's me, they said. Or rather, you. I staggered back, gripping the counter for support. This isn't funny, I said. Who are you, and how did you get this number? The laugh faded, replaced by a cold, distant tone. I told you, the voice said. I'm you. And I've been trying to warn you. Warn me about what? I asked, my heart pounding. There was a long pause, the silence heavy and suffocating. Finally, the voice spoke again, softer this time. It's already too late. You'll understand soon enough. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands trembling. My reflection stared back at me from the dark screen, pale and wide-eyed. A knock at the door made me jump. I turned toward it, my pulse racing. No one ever visited me, especially not this early. Slowly, I approached the door, every step weighted with dread. Through the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty, silent. Yet the uneasy feeling in my chest only grew stronger. When I finally opened the door, a single envelope lay on the floor, my name written on it in large, blocky letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Don't call again. My breath hitched. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. A text notification appeared on the screen. Unknown number, you've been warned. My hands shook as I stared at the text. The words seemed to burn into the screen, their presence more threatening than any physical danger. My instinct screamed to turn the phone off, to throw it into the nearest trash can, but I couldn't. I needed answers. I typed back, my thumbs hesitant on the keyboard. Who are you? What do you want? The reply came almost instantly, as though they'd been waiting for my response. It's not about what I want. It's about what you've already done. My chest tightened. What did they mean, already done? My mind raced through every interaction, every decision in the past few days, but nothing stood out. A sudden noise behind me snapped me out of my thoughts. It was faint, a creak from the floorboards in the hallway. I turned, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The phone buzzed again in my hand. It's closer than you think. What is closer? I shouted at the empty room, my voice cracking. The phone didn't respond. Instead, the lights flickered above me. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen cut out, leaving the room in unsettling silence. The power was gone. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The street was unusually quiet, almost unnaturally so. Normally, the neighborhood bustled with morning commuters, joggers, and the occasional barking dog. Now, it was empty. The air felt heavy, suffocating. My phone buzzed again. Do you see it yet? I didn't know what it was, but I was starting to suspect I didn't want to find out. I turned my head, scanning the rooftops, the parked cars, the shadows that stretched unnaturally long in the dim morning light. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the street, motionless. Too far away to make out details, but close enough to feel its presence. It didn't move, didn't sway. It just stood there, watching. I took a step back, my hand gripping the phone tightly. The figure remained still, but something about it was wrong. Its silhouette didn't seem to belong in this world. It bent slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though leaning forward to see me better. I turned and ran back inside, locking the door behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the wood. The phone buzzed again. Running won't help. I threw the phone onto the table, the screen lighting up one last time as it landed. It's already inside. A cold dread washed over me. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, searching for movement, for anything out of place. The shadows seemed darker now, more solid. The knock came again, this time from inside the apartment. It was faint, coming from the bedroom. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay where I was. But I couldn't. I crept toward the bedroom door, each step agonizingly slow. The handle was cold to the touch as I turned it, pushing the door open. The room was empty, but on the bed lay another envelope, identical to the one I had found earlier. My name was scrawled across it in the same blocky letters. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was me, sitting in this very room, staring at this very letter. But in the background of the photo, just over my shoulder, was the figure. I stumbled back, clutching the photograph, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The figure in the background was unmistakable. It was the same one I'd seen outside. Its shape seemed to ripple, as though it wasn't entirely bound by the physical world. I dropped the photo, letting it flutter to the floor. The bedroom suddenly felt oppressive, the walls closing in around me. I needed to get out, to put distance between myself and whatever this was. The phone buzzed again, its sound cutting through the silence like a knife. It's watching. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The figure was playing with me, toying with my fear. But why? I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. The apartment felt colder now, as if some unseen force had drained all the warmth. My hand trembled as I unlocked the deadbolt, stepping into the hallway. The world outside seemed wrong. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. Even the familiar hum of distant traffic was gone, replaced by an eerie quiet. My phone buzzed in my pocket again. Reluctantly, I pulled it out. Leaving won't change anything. I turned off the screen, refusing to respond. Whoever or whatever was behind this couldn't control me if I didn't let them. But the illusion of control was short-lived. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I noticed something odd. The streetlights, usually evenly spaced, seemed distorted. Their glow stretched and twisted, casting shadows that didn't align with their sources. And then I heard it. A low whisper, just barely audible, weaving through the still air. It didn't come from a single direction, but seemed to surround me, slipping into my ears no matter where I turned. The whispers grew louder, forming half-words and fragmented sentences. My name was among them, repeated over and over, as if the voices were trying to draw me in. I broke into a run. My legs carried me down familiar streets that now felt alien. The houses were dark, their windows like empty eyes watching my every move. I didn't know where I was going, anywhere but here. The whispers followed, growing more insistent, more distinct. You can't escape. It's too late. You're already his. I skidded to a stop in the middle of an intersection, panting. My phone buzzed again. Turn around. I froze. The message filled me with dread, but the compulsion to obey was overwhelming. Slowly, I turned. The figure was there. Closer this time, standing in the center of the street. Its form shimmered, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. It tilted its head, observing me, studying me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body paralyzed by the sheer weight of its presence. The phone buzzed one last time. Say goodbye. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at me. The shadows around it began to stretch, crawling toward me like living tendrils. I stumbled back, my mind screaming for me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The shadows reached my feet, coiling around my legs, pulling me toward the figure. No! I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty street. The figure's face, or what I thought was its face, began to shift, taking on a familiar shape. It was my face, distorted and lifeless, staring back at me. Darkness enveloped me, the world fading into nothingness. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the street. I was back in my apartment, lying on the cold floor. The room was dim, bathed in the faint glow of a streetlight outside the window. My head pounded, the events of the night replaying in fragments. Had it all been a nightmare? I sat up slowly, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. My phone lay nearby, the screen cracked but still functional. I reached for it hesitantly, unsure if I wanted to see what awaited me. The screen lit up. A single notification glared back at me. Missed call from unknown. My chest tightened. It couldn't be over. I pushed myself to my feet, every step toward the door feeling like a struggle. The apartment was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. As I moved through the living room, I noticed something strange. The walls were different. Subtle, almost imperceptible changes, a picture frame tilted at an odd angle, a shadow cast where no object should be. It was as if the room had shifted ever so slightly while I was unconscious. I approached the front door, drawn by an inexplicable urge. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a void of blackness. No hallway, no neighbors, just an infinite expanse of darkness stretching beyond comprehension. The whispers began again, faint but unmistakable. Why resist? It's already begun. Step through. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. My breathing was shallow, panic clawing at my chest. This wasn't my reality anymore. Something had changed, something irreversible. The phone buzzed in my hand. I hesitated before looking. Look at the mirror. I didn't want to obey, but the compulsion was undeniable. Slowly, I turned toward the mirror hanging on the wall near the kitchen. The reflection wasn't mine. It was the figure. Its smoky, distorted form stood where I should have been, its head tilted in that same unnerving way. Its face shifted again, taking on my features, but its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to pierce into my soul. Who are you? I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure in the mirror tilted its head further, its mouth curling into a sinister smile. I am you, it whispered, though its lips didn't move. The lights in the apartment flickered, and the air grew colder. The reflection began to reach toward me, its hand pressing against the surface of the mirror. The glass rippled like water, the boundary between us thinning. I backed away, but the figure's hand emerged from the mirror, followed by its arm. The room darkened further as it pulled itself through, its presence consuming all light and warmth. Stay away! I shouted, grabbing the nearest object, a lamp, and hurling it at the mirror. The glass shattered, the fragments scattering across the floor. For a moment, the figure vanished, its form dissipating into the shadows. But the relief was short-lived. The phone buzzed again, the sound deafening in the silence. I picked it up with trembling hands. Breaking the mirror won't stop me. The screen flickered, the message dissolving into a single word. Run. The lights in the apartment went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. I froze, unable to breathe, my mind screaming for escape. The hand on my shoulder was cold, unnaturally so, and its grip tightened as if to tether me in place. I turned slowly, my body unwilling but compelled, and came face to face with the figure. It stood inches away, a perfect mockery of my appearance. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, pulling me into a darkness I couldn't escape. You've always been running, it said in my voice, though it was distorted, echoing as if spoken from a great distance. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure smiled, a grotesque mimicry of human expression. "Everything you are." The words were simple, but they carried an unbearable weight. The figure raised its hand, pointing toward the phone still clutched in my hand. The screen flickered to life, displaying a live feed of me standing in the darkened apartment. But it wasn't me. The version of me on the screen smiled calmly, standing in a well-lit room that resembled my apartment before everything changed. There were no shadows, no darkness, no whispers. The figure leaned closer, its breath icy against my skin. "That's the life you could have had," it murmured. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You made a choice long ago. A small, insignificant decision that spiraled into everything you are now. I've been watching, waiting for the moment you would see me, for the moment you would understand." The figure gestured toward the phone. "But it's too late to go back now." The room began to shift around me, the walls crumbling like sand, revealing a vast, featureless void. The figure stepped back, its form dissolving into smoke that coiled around me like a living entity. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping and indistinct, until one voice emerged, clear and commanding. "You've already lost." The phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down, the screen now displaying a single option. "Answer." My heart pounded as I pressed the button, my hands moving on their own. The phone was cold against my ear. "Hello?" I whispered. There was a pause, and then I heard it, my own voice, calm and detached. "You're free now," it said. Before I could respond, the call ended and the phone disintegrated into ash in my hand. The void around me began to collapse, and I fell into nothingness, my screams swallowed by the darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was standing on a crowded street in daylight. The air was warm, the chatter of people and the hum of traffic surrounding me. Everything seemed normal. But I wasn't. People walked past me without a second glance, as if I didn't exist. I tried calling out, waving my arms, but no one reacted. I turned toward a storefront window, desperate to see my reflection, to confirm that I was still me. The glass revealed nothing. I was gone. And then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A phone ringing. Have you ever looked at something so ordinary that you didn't notice when it became strange? The evening had fallen quietly, with a soft orange glow stretching across the sky. I sat on my usual bench in the park, one of those nondescript wooden ones tucked under the canopy of tall oak trees. It was a place of solace for me, a refuge after a long day. People strolled past, couples, joggers, dog walkers, all blending into the rhythmic pulse of the city winding down. The park lights flickered on, casting warm pools of light on the ground, their glow dancing in contrast to the deepening shadows of the trees. I was lost in my thoughts, enjoying the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. But then, something felt off. At first, it was a sensation, a subtle tug in my chest like the feeling of being watched. My eyes scanned the path ahead, expecting to see someone lingering, but everyone seemed normal. A man jogging past me. A woman walking her dog. A couple laughing quietly as they strolled by. And then I noticed it. The shadows on the ground, cast by the trees and the glowing streetlights, were moving in sync with their owners. A jogger passed by, his shadow lagging behind before lurching forward unnaturally, almost as if it had to catch up. I blinked, telling myself it was a trick of the light. The park lamps were evenly spaced, and maybe my eyes were just tired. But the more I watched, the stranger it became. The woman with the dog walked on, but her shadow hesitated at the corner before darting off in the opposite direction. The couple's shadows split apart, walking separately from their human forms. I rubbed my eyes, my pulse quickening. This couldn't be real. Shadows didn't behave like that. They were bound by the laws of light, by physics. Weren't they? I told myself to leave, to brush it off as some bizarre optical illusion, but my curiosity anchored me to the bench. I started following the movements of the shadows more closely, trying to catch one that behaved normally. None of them did. And then it happened. One shadow stopped. It wasn't connected to anyone. It lingered in the middle of the path, an unnatural dark blot against the gravel. It stood there, motionless, as if it had become aware of my gaze. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the park faded into an eerie silence. Even the rustling leaves seemed to hold their breath. The shadow shifted, sliding slowly toward my bench. Closer. And closer. I clutched the edges of the bench, my nails digging into the wood, my legs frozen. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The shadow stopped just a few feet away from me, its form stretching unnaturally long across the ground, reaching toward me like a hand. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, it disappeared, sinking into the earth as if it had never existed. The park lights flickered again, and the sounds of the night returned. People walked past, their shadows once more tethered to them, moving in step like nothing had happened. But I knew. Something was wrong. Something was watching. And it wasn't finished with me. The walk home felt endless. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the shadows along the pavement stretching unnaturally long in the dim streetlights. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that rogue shadow following me. But the street was empty, save for the occasional distant hum of a passing car. Inside my apartment, the world felt smaller. The warm light of my living room lamp should have been comforting, but instead it cast long, sharp shadows against the walls. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the mundane, making tea, flipping through my phone, turning on the TV for background noise. But nothing could shake the feeling. Every time I glanced toward the corners of the room, I thought I saw movement, a flicker, a shift in the shadows. My logical brain tried to explain it away. It's just your imagination, I whispered to myself. You're tired. That's all. The tea went untouched. I paced the small living room, my thoughts circling like vultures. What had I seen in the park? Could it have been a trick of the light? A hallucination? I grabbed my phone and typed into a search engine. Shadows moving independently. The results were disappointing. A mix of paranormal blogs, scientific explanations of light refraction, and conspiracy theories. None of it felt relevant, but one article caught my eye. When Shadows Behave Strangely, a study in folklore and fear. I clicked it. The article spoke about ancient myths, stories of shadows as independent entities. In some cultures, shadows were seen as protective spirits, while in others, they were harbingers of death. My skin prickled as I read a line that felt too close to my experience. Those who see shadows untethered from their owners often describe a lingering sense of being watched, followed by an encounter that leaves them changed forever. I slammed the phone down, my chest tight. It was absurd. This was just folklore, nothing more. But deep down, I couldn't shake the memory of that shadow stopping in front of me, its form stretching unnaturally toward my bench. A knock at the door broke the silence, making me jump. I froze, staring at the door. It was late, too late for visitors. My first instinct was to ignore it, but the knock came again, louder this time. My heart pounded as I approached the door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. "Hello?" My voice wavered. Silence. I stepped back, my breath shallow. Maybe it was kids playing a prank, I thought. But as I turned to walk away, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow stretched across the floor, leading from the door toward the living room. I froze. The shadow didn't belong to me. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Shadows didn't just appear. They didn't move on their own. The shadow shifted, crawling up the wall and pooling in the corner of the ceiling like liquid darkness. It pulsed, as if alive, and I felt an overwhelming pressure in the room, as if the air itself had thickened. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't respond. It simply hung there, silent and unmoving, watching me in a way that I couldn't explain but felt deep in my bones. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow receded, slithering back down the wall and vanishing into the floor. I stood there for what felt like hours, my legs trembling, my mind grasping for any rational explanation. But there was none. Something had followed me from the park. And it was still here. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the shadow pooling in the corner, its unnatural, pulsing movement. My apartment felt alien now, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light turning the space into a maze of paranoia. By morning, I convinced myself it was stress. Perhaps I had imagined it, my mind playing tricks on me after a strange night in the park. It was easier to believe that than the alternative, that something unexplainable had followed me home. The day passed in a blur. I went to work, buried myself in tasks, and avoided conversations. My coworkers noticed my distraction but didn't press. Even in the crowded office, I felt isolated, as though the shadow lingered just beyond my vision. By the time I got home, the sun was already setting, casting long, warm beams through the windows. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that everything was fine. Almost. I turned on every light in the apartment, refusing to let the shadows grow. The warmth of the light felt like a barrier, fragile but necessary. I cooked dinner, forcing myself to go through the motions of normalcy. But as I sat down to eat, I noticed it again. The shadows along the walls seemed wrong. They weren't where they should be. The light from the lamp should have cast them directly behind the furniture, but instead, they leaned at odd angles, stretching toward me like dark fingers. I pushed my plate away, my appetite gone. Grabbing my phone, I decided to call someone, anyone, just to hear a familiar voice. I dialed my sister, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried a friend from work. Same result. I stared at my phone, my stomach sinking. The isolation felt deliberate, as though whatever was happening didn't want me to reach out for help. Then my phone buzzed in my hand. The screen lit up with an incoming call. But it wasn't from a contact I recognized. The caller ID simply read, "Unknown number." My hand trembled as I accepted the call and raised the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. There was no response. Just silence. "Who is this?" I demanded, my fear giving way to frustration. A soft sound came through the line, a faint static, growing louder by the second. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. My own voice. "It's too late," the voice said, calm and distant. "You shouldn't have looked." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding so loudly I could feel it in my ears. My own voice. How was that possible? A sudden knock at the door made me jump, the sound sharp and demanding. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, rattling the doorframe. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer. I crept toward the door, my footsteps hesitant. Peering through the peephole, I expected to see an empty hallway like before. But this time, there was someone there. Or something. It looked human at first, a tall figure in a dark coat, standing unnaturally still. But as I squinted, I realized something was wrong. The figure didn't have a face. Where its features should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking stopped, replaced by a soft scratching sound, like nails dragging across the wood of the door. I backed away, clutching the phone in my hand as though it could protect me. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped abruptly. Silence filled the apartment. And then the lights went out. I froze, the darkness swallowing the room. My phone's screen was the only source of light, casting a weak glow that barely reached the walls. Somewhere behind me, I heard it. A faint, slithering sound, like fabric dragging across the floor. I turned slowly, the light from my phone trembling as I raised it. In the corner of the room, the shadow was back, darker and more defined than ever. It seemed to swell, growing larger, its edges shifting and rippling like smoke. And then, from the center of the shadow, a hand emerged. It wasn't human. The fingers were too long, too thin, each tipped with sharp, claw-like nails. I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The hand reached toward me, the shadow dragging itself closer inch by inch. I screamed. The scream echoed through the dark apartment, but there was no one to hear it. My chest tightened as I stumbled backward, clutching the phone like it was my only lifeline. The shadow surged forward, its hand stretching unnaturally, clawing at the air between us. I bolted. The hallway was pitch black, my bare feet slapping against the floor as I ran toward the front door. My fingers fumbled for the lock, shaking so violently that it took me 3 tries to twist it open. As I yanked the door wide, I risked a glance back. The shadow was no longer confined to the corner. It spread like a pool of ink, crawling along the walls and ceiling, its amorphous form chasing me with terrifying purpose. I didn't wait to see more. I ran down the corridor, the building's dim emergency lights barely illuminating the way. The fluorescent bulbs flickered erratically, casting the space in bursts of light and shadow that played tricks on my mind. Every flash seemed to show the shadow closer, its presence bleeding into every surface. When I reached the stairwell, I practically threw myself through the door. The air inside was cold, carrying an unsettling stillness. I gripped the railing and started descending, my footsteps echoing loudly. But the shadow didn't care about stairs. From above, I heard the telltale hiss of its movement, the sound of something unnatural sliding down the walls. I dared to glance upward and instantly regretted it. The shadow wasn't following the stairs, it was falling down the vertical shaft, its mass twisting and writhing as it pursued me. Faster. I muttered to myself, pushing my legs harder. By the time I reached the ground floor, my lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out. I burst through the stairwell door into the lobby, nearly colliding with the front desk. But the lobby wasn't empty. A figure stood near the exit, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights outside. At first, I thought it was another tenant, someone I could beg for help. But as I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't right. It was tall and gaunt, its body unnaturally rigid. Its face, if you could call it that, was a featureless void, like the thing I'd seen outside my door. It tilted its head toward me, as though it could see despite the lack of eyes. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. It didn't move. I edged toward the glass doors, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. My shaking hands found the door handle, and I pushed it open, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I ran again. The city felt deserted. Streetlights buzzed faintly, their illumination casting long, lonely shadows. Every alley, every darkened window seemed to hide something watching, waiting. I didn't know where I was going, just away. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The shadow, the voice on the phone, the faceless figure, what did it all mean? Then I felt it. A change in the air. The street ahead of me darkened, as though the night had grown heavier. I turned my head and saw it. The shadow was spilling out of the alleyways, spreading across the asphalt like a living tide. "No, no, no!" I gasped, turning down another street. My legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The shadow was relentless, moving faster now, cutting off my escape routes. I turned a corner and found myself in a park, the same park where this nightmare began. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in an unfelt breeze. The shadows here were deeper, thicker, merging with the entity chasing me. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I lay there, gasping for air, as the world around me seemed to slow. The shadow was here. It coiled around the trees, oozing across the ground like tar. I scrambled to my feet, backing away until my back hit the trunk of a massive oak. There was nowhere left to run. The shadow gathered before me, its mass rising like a wave. And from within it, the faceless figure emerged again, stepping forward with a deliberate, predatory grace. "You can't escape," it said, but the voice wasn't its own. It was mine. The figure raised a hand, and the shadow surged toward me. I screamed again, raising my arms to shield myself as the darkness enveloped me. And then, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the park. The world around me was hazy, distorted, as though I was looking through a fogged window. My body felt cold, numb. I tried to move, but found myself frozen in place, unable to even twitch my fingers. Panic surged within me, but my chest remained still, the breath locked inside. It was a familiar place, but wrong. The room I was in looked like my apartment, my own furniture, my kitchen, my belongings, but everything was slightly off. The colors were muted, washed out, and the light was strange, flickering in a way that made it hard to focus. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting in and out as though they weren't made of solid matter. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. From the corner of the room, a figure moved toward me, slowly, deliberately. It was taller than any person I had ever seen, its shape more like a silhouette, the features impossibly blank. I knew without seeing its face that it was the same entity that had been chasing me. The same shadow that had twisted itself into my nightmare. It stopped in front of me, and I felt a cold presence press against my mind. I couldn't look away, my body paralyzed in place as it loomed closer. Then, its voice echoed inside my head, my voice. "It's too late to change anything." The words chilled me to the bone. A wave of nausea hit me, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. But then I realized what it was. It wasn't the world that had shifted. It was me. The shadow had gotten inside my head, had stolen my own essence. It had pulled me from the world I knew into this hollow place, a world twisted by its influence. I wasn't me anymore. I had become part of it. The figure reached out, its hand slipping into mine, as though there was no barrier between us. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever felt, cold, yet burning, heavy with an unbearable weight. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. But something in the back of my mind screamed at me, a distant, haunting voice telling me to fight. I don't know why or how, but I somehow wrenched my hand free. My body wasn't mine anymore, but the will to survive had taken over. I pushed myself backward, out of the figure's grasp, and suddenly I was falling, not onto the ground, but into darkness. Into nothingness. For a long, disorienting moment, I drifted, weightless and alone. The oppressive silence was deafening. And then, I opened my eyes. I was back in the park, the trees still standing, the grass beneath me damp with dew. But everything was quiet. The shadow was gone. I rose to my feet slowly, my hands trembling as I looked around. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I had never been chased, never faced the unrelenting terror. But I knew it wasn't over. The park felt different now. The air was heavy with a presence I couldn't quite place, like the world was watching me from the edges of my mind. Something was still there, lingering, waiting. I looked at my phone. My hands were steady now, but there was a message. A simple text. "It's not over yet. You can't escape." I swallowed hard, feeling the truth of it sinking in. I hadn't escaped. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own reflection. The shadow would always be there, always waiting. And I would never be free. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.